Until fairly recently in British and indeed English history, treason was a very serious thing. Nowadays, the Treason Act of 1998 means that anyone convicted of treason will be sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, as I say, in the old days, it was all the rage, what we did to traitors. And executions, have always been a long part of London history, from before the Roman Empire all the way through to the 1950s, when the death penalty was abolished, and Ruth Ellis was the last hanged in 1955. Now, as far as London was concerned, it was effectively the country. Had a much larger population than any other town. The king lived there, the parliament was based there. From around the mid-14th century, most executions, and they weren't all treason related, took place at Tyburn, which is now where modern-day Marble Arch is, and it's basically a traffic junction more than anything nowadays. It was a fairly gruesome business at the best of times, but well attended by spectators. A few hundred along the way gathered, maybe a few thousand at certain points, tens of thousands during moments like the restoration of the throne in 1660. Along the way, things changed in the sense that in the 16th century, the Tyburn tree was built, essentially a triangular-shaped wooden gallows that at any one time could hang 24 people, 8 per section. Indeed. My maths. But they also were taken to Smithfield, where the meat market is still, and Smithfield were fields in those days, just a little bit north of St Paul's Cathedral. And at some point, they built gallows at the likes of Newgate, Aldgate, and Leadenhall. And Newgate Prison ceased to exist really in the early 20th century when the Old Bailey was built over it, and some of the old prison cells are still down there in bits and pieces. Newgate became a fairly notorious place in more ways than one, and it's in most of Charles Dickens's novels like Oliver Twist and Barnaby Rudge. And indeed, some of the prisoners would start their journey there down to Tyburn. At the same time, though, they were also being taken from Newgate and the like down to Execution Dock in Wapping, where we saw the prospect of Whitby earlier in the week. At least 30,000 people were executed at Tyburn between the 14th and 18th centuries when it started to pack up. Now, if you take Tyburn, for instance, they started their journey in Newgate and headed west, of course, so they would have joined where the War Courts of Justice now are, I'd imagine, the Aldwych, and then come down the Tyburn Way. And the Tyburn Way is still with us. It's now known as Oxford Street, the most populous and busy shopping street in Western Europe. And your Primarks and whatnot are usually open on a good day till 11 o'clock at night, except for Sundays, because of Sunday trading hours. Now, the Tyburn Way, up until fairly recently, maybe 3 centuries ago, had pubs or taverns along the way, a dozen or so. And the prisoners were allowed their last drinks along the way. They climbed off the wagon to do so, because the next time they got on the wagon, they were sometimes horizontal in more ways than one. So the expression falling off the wagon, as far as drinking is concerned, is said to have originated on dear old Tyburn Way. And then, as I say, they met their fate on the gallows. Some women were executed along the way, but it was mostly men like Jack Sheppard and the like. And during the restoration of the throne from 1660, Charles II was taking revenge on the men who'd executed his father, the regicides, those who had signed the king's death warrant, and a few others that had sided against his father before and after the civil wars. And so they were brought. Some of them were brought to Tyburn and hung, drawn, and quartered. Some of it took place at the Tower because people were getting a little bit sick of the sight of it at Tyburn, and also people were getting tired of the idea of it. I mean, Charles started in 1660 and effectively was still hunting down regicides by the time he died in 1685. Now, one of the most famous prisoners, so to speak, executed at Tyburn in 1661 was Oliver Cromwell, who had ruled over this country as Lord Protector from 1649 to 1659. I was thinking 1652 because of the Battle of Worcester, so my apologies. But yes, he ruled as Lord Protector. We call him a dictator nowadays, and what he did in 1649 and 1652 you'd refer to, in, I suppose, as a military coup d'etat. He removed Parliament, some of the members of Parliament in 1652 by force. So anyway, Cromwell ruled over us till 1659 when he died, and he was executed in 1661. He was buried, when he died in 1659, in a ceremony to rival any monarch. For a man who would not want to title king and loathed what the monarchy had stood for by 1649, he nonetheless was a king in all but name, and things might have been quite different had he called himself king, or not, if it all fell apart anyway. Cromwell was buried in Westminster Abbey, where the Battle of Britain Chapel now is, or the memorial to him. And in 1661, his body was unearthed and taken, along with a couple of other chaps who had died, and I forget their names, Monmouth, I'm sure, was one of them, and hanged and hung, drawn, and quartered. Well, hung, drawn, and quartered, but includes the hanging, in front of a slightly ecstatic crowd. God knows what they thought of it in those days. Judging by the crowds, probably not anything. It was a spectator sport, really, until the 19th century. And differences in the 19th century, by the time it was winding down, you could get the underground to Tyburn if you wanted to see, because Marble Arch, Chancery Lane, St Paul's are on the central line. Anyway, Cromwell was executed. His body was hung in a goblet, or giblet, to decay, the head on London Bridge, and so on and so forth. Only once on the buses did I ever get anyone sort of like really fascinated by it. Apparently she was laughing and enjoying herself. So make of that what you will, but no one else. You don't always mention it on the buses, I find. It depends, if the driver has taken that little Transport for London shortcut through the middle, or the state of the traffic, who you got on the bus, whether you're feeling like you can't do the tour and you've had enough for the day. That's not to say I ever shut. I mean, only towards the end I get the feeling that I just couldn't get bothered. Especially the day before we lost our jobs, when they said I was starting at 10:30, the latest start I've had in ages, 11:30 almost. And I turned up. By the time I turned up, 5 of my friends had been fired. So my heart wasn't in it. I tried my best on the first tour. It was 3.5 hours long almost. And I knew I was going to be the last one out, being the last sign on. And they were wanting me in twice as early the next day for a Tower London start. So my heart, and no one was getting interrupted, and I was being shouted at. But the executions carried on, as I say, until the mid 18th century at Tyburn, and then relocated to the likes of Newgate and what have you. And the last hanging, as I say, was in 55, by which point the public opinion was very firmly against capital punishment, and now there are those that say it should be back. And also the treason is still a thing in this country. It just doesn't seem to be taken seriously enough. You don't expect everyone to be flag waving in this nation. But in the day, treason was taken awfully seriously. I mean, the regicides were accused of treason. The King, Charles I, was ultimately executed on the charge of treason, because legally that was the way I suppose they could get away with him. They didn't want him to be living in exile, the king over the water, so to speak. So treason, there's still something like 7 treason acts in motion from 1351 onwards, but the 1998 Act has changed things around, because as I say, nowadays it's life imprisonment. Now the last person tried and indeed executed for treason was Lord Haw, aka William Joyce, in 1945, and he was a mouthpiece of the Nazi regime. If you read the book Traitors by, I believe it's Josh Island, or John, which he quotes quite a lot from my mentors and my mentoring tutor at the University of Westminster. But he writes about Lord Haw and 4 other people. And Haw seemed to have a screw loose or two. He went to Berlin in September 1939, probably or at least just before war was declared, and was asked, why are you going out there? He was not coming back, and ultimately he was captured by British forces. And he was a figure of derision in this country, but as you've seen the Dunkirk film from 1958, in April, May 1940, there were still people in this country listening to him, believing what he was saying. I wouldn't say he was the Alex Jones of his day, but he was spreading misinformation and worry and fear and the like, and people in this nation didn't really expect what was going to happen. It seemed like it was like the First War, but with no action. Poland gets annihilated in September 1939. We sink, or at least take on, the battlecruiser Graf Spray in December 1939. There's some skirmishes here and there. Finland is taken out by Russia, and then next thing you know, in April 1940, Hitler invades Norway and the Low Countries, and that wasn't in the cards. And then on May 10th, he invades France and the he invades Norway and the like in April 1940, Denmark, and then France and the Low Countries in May 1940. And 2 weeks later, he's on the coast. That never happened in the First War. So the phony war was where Lord Haw probably had his greatest success in this country. However, he was tried, executed, and alongside Julian Amery, the son of the MP Leo, who, Julian at any rate, had gone to Germany and whatnot, and tried to raise something called the Legion of St. George, basically British men from the POW camps to fight in Hitler's SS, as it ultimately became they were in the SS. Now, if you read anything about the British Freikorps or the British Free Corps, the BFK was absolute embarrassment. No one in the POW camps, of course, really wanted to do that. I mean, Amory's posters were used as toilet paper. Once he had to be escorted rather quickly because the camp was going to turn against him and lynch him, and the Germans weren't too enamoured of Amory. He had screws loose. He was a sexual deviant in their eyes as well, and some poor German chap got tasked ultimately with training what few recruits. The BFK, if you read Adrian Will's book Renegades or Josh Island's book Traitors, never really was what other units were. I mean, I think the BFK had no more than 20 men in it at any one time, and these men that were recruited, so to speak, were chancers and criminals and the like, and some people just wanted to saw it as an opportunity to get out of the POW camp and have a lark. And yet the Germans intended on putting these men into action. And there's a legend, no one knows for sure, I don't think, whether or not they did, but there's a legend that some of them ended up fighting in the Battle of Berlin, which happened 75 years ago this week, until early May 1945, of course, when the war ended. So there were these chaps, and by and large only Amory was dealt with seriously. The others were taken on, but that wasn't really the energy, I don't think. After that, Treason sort of faded from the public consciousness until the Cambridge spies, the likes of Kim Philby. And Philby ultimately ended up escaping from his home in Lebanon to Mother Russia to defect because the heat was closing. Now, I suggested that his old friend Nicholas more or less went out there to warn him. Well, no, not warn him, but just give him the opportunity to sort of maybe get out. And my laptop's decided to carry on. People, if you read Ben McIntyre's brilliant book, A Spy Among Friends, that's the insinuation, but there's also the suggestion that had Philby been brought back to London and arrested and tried publicly, it would have been an embarrassment for the government, probably would have brought down the government. I believe Macmillan was Prime Minister at the time, and he already had the Profumo scandal to deal with and various other things coming along. And also, there was no appetite for it. If they let him escape to Russia, he's out of their hair, and indeed when he got to Russia, the KGB didn't fully trust him. The Russians didn't have any use for him, really. He did some tutoring and anything else at the KGB, and when he died in the 80s, he got a full military escort, funeral anyway. So that was probably the last time this country dealt with treason until 2001, when we joined the American invasion of Afghanistan. There's suggestions in the years afterwards, around about 2005 time, when Blair was still PM, that considering charging anyone that had gone off the fight for the Taliban with treason, because they were fighting our chaps. And then it reared its head a couple of years ago with the ISIS recruits, like the so-called Beatles of ISIS, the 4 chaps from Manchester or wherever they went. The closest we've gotten to anything serious, really, is those that have gone to fight ISIS, not for ISIS. So there's that. And they've been charged, and some of them have died. And then you had that girl who went off to marry ISIS fighter has had a baby brother. He's dead, and she was trying to come home last year or the year before. She's in a refugee camp and saying, "Oh, I didn't mean to do that." And it's like, well, no, treason is treason. Some people are saying you betrayed your country by going out there. You knew what you were doing, and all the rest of it. So there's complications, and I don't think we're ever going to take treason the way we did. I'm not saying you should bring back the gallows and the like, but treason, betraying your country, used to be quite serious in this country. So in London, it took place over 500, 600 years, and now no longer happens. And as I say, Tyburn is now Marble Arch. So if you're in London, your closest tube station, funny enough, is Marble Arch tube station on the Central Line. And then if you head east on the Central Line, you can go to, I think the closest one really would be Chancery Lane, and walk down to the Royal Courts of Justice, walk up to the Old Bailey, or come down from St Paul's Tube, and that's where Newgate used to be. And the overground, of course, out to Wapping and whatnot. So that's your executions. If you want more on it, I'll see what I can do. We'll figure out what our next topic will be. I'm thinking about Portsmouth, not because I'm wearing the bloody shirts, but yeah, we'll see what happens, shall we?